Hello and welcome to my channel Polyglot Reading. My name is David, and on my channel I usually talk about classics from the German, Italian, English, French and Yiddish literature. Today I would like to present you the Yiddish author Sholem Asch and his novel Mottke the Thief, which is the perfect introduction to this author's work. But first, as usual, a short introduction to the author himself, whose name may still be familiar to some people and who was extremely successful during his lifetime, even after the Second World War, and was translated in many languages, but who is hardly on the radar of publishers and readers today. Sholem Asch was a fascinating author because he permanently crossed all sorts of borders, both in a figurative and a very real sense. Not only did he change his place of residence and country extremely often, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes out of necessity, he was also incredibly versatile and experimental in his literary works. He was successfully at home in all literary genres, writing prose ranging from short stories to wide-ranging novels, some poetry, numerous essays, and also very successful dramas that were performed on stages across the world. And all this at an impressive production rate. In 1924, when he was just 44 years old and still had more than 30 productive years ahead of him, an 18-volume edition of his works was published in Warsaw, Poland. And yeah, he also disregarded the usual literary categories and trends. He moved carelessly across the boundaries of naturalism, realism, neo-romanticism, etc., according to just his mood and his perceived artistic necessities of the sujet he wanted to, of the subject he wanted to treat. Another important achievement of Sholem Asch was that he was one of the first Yiddish writers to liberate Yiddish literature from its confinement to the purely Yiddish world, to the Eastern European shtetl, and to open it up to other subjects and genres. But first things first, let's start with a short bio of Sholem Asch. Sholem Asch was born in 1880 in Kutno, which is a town about 100 kilometers west of Warsaw in Poland. He was born into a traditional Hasidic family. So his parents had destined him to become a rabbi. So he initially received the usual religious education in Torah, Talmud, and Haggadah. But through a friend, however, he came into contact with the writings of the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, and whose books he read in secret. And when this was discovered by his parents, it was already too late. He had already become far too independent and liberal a thinker for a religious career. And so attempts were made to train him for the more secular profession of a Hebrew teacher. He began writing at around the age of 17 years, initially in Hebrew, but when at the age of 19 at Warsaw, he made the acquaintance of Leib Peretz, who was the #1 of Yiddish writers in those days. He became convinced to switch to Yiddish as his primary writing language. And yeah, he was able to publish his first works at the age of 22. But the first ones were still rooted in the more traditional previous experience of the Jewish shtetl. But his first international breakthrough in success came with his play Der Gott von Nekome, The God of Vengeance, which was written in Cologne, Germany, in 1906, so at the age of 26 years, and in which he demonstrated his border-crossing qualities for the first time. It is a Yiddish play about a Jewish brothel owner with Jewish prostitutes and even some lesbian scenes, and that was unheard of at that time. And the fact that this brothel owner wants to restore his reputation by commissioning the making of a Torah in order to marry off his daughter to a well-renowned yeshiva student, such an attack on moral standards or such a demonstration of bigoted sham morality was, of course, scandalous for the traditionalists. However, Sholem Asch was not lacking in chutzpah, and so he went to Berlin. He presented the play to the famous Max Reinhardt, who was the #1 theater director in Germany at the time, and the play was accepted and played for 6 months at the Deutsches Theater in Berlin. And translations and performances in over a dozen other countries followed shortly. At the beginning of World War I in 1914, Asch moved to the US with his family and began writing for the Yiddish daily newspaper Forwards. And by 1920, he became an American citizen. He later returned to Europe for a few more years, living in both France and Poland, but he returned to the US in time in 1938, before things really got very bad for Jews in Central Europe. His success as a writer also enabled him to travel extensively, for example, in the Soviet Union and in Palestine. As a rather independent thinker, Sholem Asch naturally did not only make friends. When he wrote 3 biographies, one of Jesus, Mary, and the Apostle Paul in the late 1940s, he went beyond the boundaries of what his contemporaries, in particular his contemporary Jewish citizens, were prepared to tolerate. And his aim was simply to bridge the gap between Christianity and Judaism and create more understanding for one another. However, this was interpreted by his Jewish contemporaries as a betrayal of Judaism, and he was falsely accused of having converted to Christianity. And even the decidedly non-religious Yiddish newspaper Forwards, for which he worked, they not only terminated his contract, but they also attacked him publicly. And whether out of defiance or economic necessity, Sholem Asch once again crossed another line and began writing for the newspaper Morgen Freiheit, which was very close to communist ideas. And this was not a good idea in McCarthy-era America, where any hint of closeness to communism was viewed as hostile to the state and could result in questioning, interrogation, and sort of social ostracism. And so, torn and tired by these conflicts, Sholem Asch left the USA in 1953 and spent the last years of his life traveling back and forth between London, where his daughter lived, and Palestine, where he died in 1957. Mottke the Thief is a genre of novel for which I have really a weak spot, namely a picaresque novel, but one that ends tragically. Mottke the Thief is a story of a very strong-minded and greedy young man who comes from the poorest of circumstance and only survives because he learns at the age of just a few months to take by force what he needs to live, regardless of what is mine or yours. It's simply to avoid dying by hunger. So one in his first years of life is still a harmless, almost humorously portrayed case of mouth robbery, and born purely out of the will to survive that leads to a more fundamental attitude of pure opportunism to get what he needs or wants. And so he becomes a crook, a petty swindler, and a pimp, and even a murderer, but never a thoroughly unsympathetic and despicable character. He has a good core and even makes an attempt to become a decent man in the end for the sake of a woman. But I want to give that away in advance, whether this works out or not. So we don't have a hero here who is forced by necessity to overcome some moral scruples, but somebody who has never known these scruples at all, because sheer necessity has always, from the very beginning, forced him to do what is pragmatic and ensures his survival. And although the novel has mainly Jewish characters, it is not set in the typical shtetl world, and there's no sense of idyllic nostalgia here. It is set among Jews who live in a normal, small Polish town among non-Jews, not in a ghetto, and it is set in the milieu of the poorest of the poor, in the demi-monde or underworld of shady characters, of beggars, of gangsters and crooks. And Asch depicts this milieu very vividly and in great detail, but never with a lecturing or socially critical gesture, never with a tone of moral indignation. He simply describes in a matter-of-fact way the milieu as an objective fact and allows the character traits and events to develop from it with an almost inevitable logic. And he managed the admirable tightrope act of even striking a partly humorous tone without it coming across as false or superficial or awkward. Mottke's essential character traits, the lawless and the uncontrollably passionate, are already beautifully hinted at in the love story of his parents, the story of Leib the Blind One and the Red Slutke, which takes up the first few chapters of the novel. Blind Leib, when he still could see, was the most talented shoemaker far and wide, and his employers were always lenient with his capers of not turning up for work or even sometimes hitting them right in the face with a shoe out of anger, simply because nobody could make shoes as well as Leib could. When Leib fell in love with the maid, the Red Slutke, everyone warns her against this halodrious and foolish man, but she is absolutely smitten with him, and all he has to do is whistle under her kitchen window and she drops everything, regardless of whether the pots on the stove are burning, to go out on the streets with her Leib, but not without first making a big foray into her master's pantry to spoil Leib with roasts and other delicacies. But Leib wouldn't be Leib if he left other beautiful girls on the sidelines, despite his official engagement to Slutke. And so it comes as it must. Leib, one day, he no longer shows up at Slutke's, but suddenly spends his days with Basche, the beautiful dressmaker. Outraged with jealousy, Slutke lies in wait for them and burns Leib's face with vitriolic acid. And completely disfigured and with only one eye left, Leib is now helpless, unemployed. And now it's in Slutke who nurses and cares for him, and the two marry in a kind of love and hate relationship. And Leib, however, now he can't work as a shoemaker anymore. He doesn't see well enough. He can only work as a porter. And what little wages he receives, he squanders. And so they have to live in a cellar hole together with several other families. A child is born every year, and the only way to feed the family is for Slutke to hire herself out as a wet nurse, that is, to breastfeed other newborn babies for rich families if their mothers are unable to do so or are too delicate or too elegant for such animalistic activities. And so their own children have to manage without maternal care and also without breast milk. And because Leib also drinks up most of the wet nurse money, so the youngest newborn usually is only given a damp rag with a sugar cube tied into it and to suckle on it. And about half of these newborns of Leib and Slutke die because of this diet, and the other half somehow manage to survive until they're big enough to crawl out of the cellar hole onto the street and steal food from other richer children. And Mottke is one of these children who make it because he has a strong will to live. He has stubbornness and assertiveness at a level that is quite unusual even for Slutke's children. And despite the wretchedness of the situation, it is also with a high degree of humor, that Sholem Asch describes the scene in which Mottke's first foray outside the cellar at home is described. How the indignant mothers literally splash out of the houses to protect their little ones from this merciless Mottke who snatches bread or cake away from them and make them cry. So, and this is how Mottke grows up, driven by the need to steal food just to survive. And later, to greater thievery. Yeah? So he's caught stealing and beaten half to death by his father. He flees from home. He ekes out a living as a vagabond, as a glass blower, and as a member of a showman's troupe. And he falls in with the pimps in Warsaw until his love for a young woman makes him yearn to become a decent person. But maybe it's already too late for that. Who knows? I won't tell you, and I've skipped over Mottke's actual life story in these 2 or 3 sentences, because I think that I did that deliberately, because I think the backstory up to his first foray is crucial to understanding his character and the atmosphere of the book, but I don't want to spoil the actual plot for you. So, Mottke the Thief is a somewhat different, picaresque novel, and it's certainly an unusual Yiddish novel if you measure it against the more widespread cliches about Yiddish shtetl nostalgia literature. And in this depiction of the demi-monde and the underworld, the novel was a real innovation in Yiddish literary world at the time. And through this slightly humorous treatment of a very serious and outrageous topic of the impoverishment of the masses, it also has a very unique artistic approach to the subject, at least unique at its time. Sholem Asch refrains from any social indictment or mawkishness. So Charles Dickens would have approached such a plot in a completely different way. Sholem Asch leaves it at the depiction of Mottke's story in the guise of a picaresque novel and in a very matter-of-factly way, but with a humorous undertone. And fascinatingly, this also has a social critical effect. But the ostensibly light-footed and humorous narrative technique delays the onset of horror and indignation. So the bombs that Sholem Asch let explode under our feet are bombs with a time fuse. And that makes it more bearable to the reader. I often found myself smiling or even laughing while reading, only to think just a few seconds later, wait a minute, what are you reading here? It should make your stomach turn, it should make you cry. But the whole thing is described as if it were incredibly amusing. It could be told with a tongue-in-cheek attitude, but without coming across as false, inappropriate, or skewed. I don't know how Asch manages to do this, but it always gives me the impression that Mottke's story has to be told in exactly this way and no other. And I think this is an indication of a really well-made literature. So, Mottke the Thief by Sholem Asch. See if you can get it at an antiquarian bookstore or at the usual second-hand platforms. I think it's out of print nowadays, but good luck with hunting. Enjoy reading it. Thanks. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hope to see you next time. Take care. Bye and ciao.